Great. Thank you very much, everyone who is attending. Welcome to our last Technical Friday of the year. My name is Mike Pissarro. I am the Policy Director for the Watershed Institute. And as I said, we're here for Technical Friday, and we are going to be talking about road salts. Just a couple things to get going. I can get my screen to advance. Okay, so we are recording this. We will be sending you a recording and a follow-up email. Usually takes several days for us to get that email out, so you will be getting the recording. Don't worry. If you have questions, there is a question and answer function on the bottom of your screen. We will be monitoring that and we'll be asking questions. We usually take most of our questions at the end of the session. But occasionally I will jump in if I see a question that I think needs to be answered right away. We appreciate your participation. This has been a very successful series this year, and we're looking to continue it for next year. So we have a land acknowledgement. We recognize that the land and water now under our care is the traditional and ancestral territory of the Lenni Lenape. We pay respect to the Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. We respect their knowledge, culture, and tradition, which have contributed to the conservation of land and water. If you don't know the Watershed Institute, we are a watershed association located in central New Jersey in Hopewell Township. Our mission is keeping water clean, safe, and healthy is the heart of our mission. We work to protect and restore our water and natural environment in central New Jersey through conservation, advocacy, science, and education. And we also administer several statewide programs in New Jersey. And we do all of that through various strategies, including science, advocacy, education, and modeling some of the best practices at our Watershed Center, again, here in Hopewell, New Jersey, on a 950-acre reserve. All right, so with that, I'm going to introduce our two speakers and get going. So first off, we have Erin Stretz, who's our Assistant Director of Science and Stewardship. And I've lost my screen, I apologize. And Erin, will you introduce Deborah? Because I've completely lost my screen.
Sure, yeah. So I'm going to start by talking about road salt itself, how we use it, how much we use it, how it impacts our freshwaters. Then I'll go into the New Jersey Salt Watch program. And I'm just peeking at some of the attendees today. And some of you are very active participants, volunteers in our program. So I just want to start by saying thank you. We literally could not do this without you. So after I go over the bad news and the data, then Debbie is going to take it from there. Deborah Kratzer is an environmental specialist from the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, Bureau of Environmental Analysis, Restoration, and Standards. And she'll talk the regulatory side and give us some practical tips for how to move forward. So I'm going to share my screen. One moment. Now's not the time to freeze. There we go. Oh boy. There we are. All right. So yes, thank you so much and welcome. Again, I am Erin Stretz. I'm the Assistant Director of Science and Stewardship at the Watershed Institute. I also run a program called the New Jersey Watershed Watch Network, and that is our statewide outreach arm to other environmental organizations doing water quality monitoring in the state of New Jersey. And it is under that network that we have run our New Jersey Salt Watch program. So I'll get into all of that and what that means a little bit later. But first, I want to talk about snow and road salt. These days, I don't know about you, but when it snows, I kind of expect the world to keep moving. Like if I were to have a medical emergency at my house, I would want the ambulance to come. We would want first responders to remain on the roads and be able to get where they need to go. You may need to continue to go back and forth to work. You could be an essential worker or just someone who needs to get to the office, but we do expect that we kind of are able to get back into the office when we need to. We expect our goods to be able to keep shipping around the country. We don't want delays in our Amazon orders and things. And I don't know about you, but in this house, we almost always order snow pizza. And so my life would be a little bit more sad without snow pizza. But it wasn't always that way. We have very high expectations these days. But back before 1941, the expectations were much lower. People, when it snowed, really weren't expecting to be able to move out and about on the roads. If someone did need to leave the house before 1941, they would tend to use something like a physical, an abrasive to create physical traction on the road or on the sidewalk. Then in the winter of 1941 to 1942, New Hampshire kind of initiated this new program. They were the first state to start using road salt, applying salt to their roads in order to melt that snow. In that first season, they used about 5,000 tons. And then after World War II, this idea that took hold in New Hampshire started spreading throughout the Northeast, throughout the Midwest, all those snowy states. And our expectations as a society increased along with our use of road salt. So the amount of road salt that we used every year doubled, doubled every 5 years until about the 1970s. So we went from using 1 million tons in 1955 to 8 million tons in 1970. That leveled off a bit through the 70s. We used 10 million tons in 1985. And then our expectations took off, as well as the amount of road salt we were using. So the most recent year we have data is 2021. And that year we used more than 25 million tons. Now this is all across the United States in all of our snowy states. So there's a few different types of salt-based de-icing techniques that we use. The most common would be regular rock salt. This is sodium chloride. And this is just, the same as what you would use as table salt. It's just bigger crystals and less purified. So we can sprinkle the salt on the roads. We can liquefy it, add some water to create a brine. But in both of these cases, the mechanism is the same. What we're doing is we're lowering that point of freezing. So pure water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius. By adding salts into that solution, we're going to depress that freezing point, lower that freezing point. When we add sodium chloride to water, to snow, it of course depends on how much snow you have and how much salt you're using, but it's generally effective. It can lower that freezing point down to about 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes it gets a little bit colder than that, and so sodium chloride just isn't as effective. In those cases, there are different additives that we can use to kind of make our rock salt a little bit more effective. Magnesium chloride is an example of that. That further depresses that freezing point. So that's something that we would use below 25 degrees. That should be Fahrenheit, not Celsius. And then for calcium chloride, that's another additive that we might use. And that just speeds that melting time. If we have like kind of an emergency situation, we can add that. It clears the roads relatively quickly so we can keep moving. So specifically in New Jersey, here's a look at how much of those different kinds of de-icers that we've used over the past 9 or so years. Just want to note that the data is not yet available for this last winter season, 2021 to 22. So we're looking a little bit further back. But for road salt itself, this is physical road salt, not liquefied, not brine. We can see that our use of road salt since the 2013-2014 winter season was kind of stable, maybe declined a little bit. Of course, this is going to fluctuate relative to how much snow we're actually getting. But it's kind of leveled off a little bit. Now, let's compare that to our use of brine. We've had quite a bit of an increase since the beginning of this chart in 2013. We really hit a high of the use of brine in the 2018-2019 winter season. We used 2 million gallons of brine across the whole state. So why? What happened in 2018? Well, let's see if you can remember. It really literally feels like a lifetime ago. But in November of 2018, there was kind of this freak snowstorm, this freak sleet, and it kind of happened in the middle of a work day. And, around 1 p.m., this like ice started falling from the sky and causing black ice all over the highways, all over the roads. People were already in the office, but they needed to get home. And so that evening, a trip from the office to home that may have taken someone a half hour, maybe even up to an hour, it took 5 hours, 6 hours for people to get home that evening. You may, if you like kind of cycled back through your memory, you may be able to remember that if you were, commuting to the office and coming home in November of 2018. So that was kind of a huge disaster, and Governor Murphy really took it on the chin for that, for not having been prepared for that incident. We caused a lot of delays, a lot of economic losses across the state. And so his response to that was to apply brine to our roads whenever there was a slight breeze after that point. And so we see that in the amount of brine that is used in that winter season. So brine, when it's applied, it has this kind of stripy look. There's these sprayers attached to the back of trucks. They're like placed equidistant, and they spray that liquefied salt on the roads. It creates that stripy pattern. And so basically from November 2018 through March 2019, all of our roads were striped because we really didn't want to have another one of those big traffic delays again. Of course, there was backlash to not having applied road salt. There was backlash to applying too much, to kind of overcorrecting. So here's this tweet, your tax dollars literally down the drain, hashtag war on imaginary storms. So he did try to correct, overcorrected, however. But how does that impact the bottom line? So this white line, these are the expenditures shown on the right side of this x-axis. And you can see that our use of so much brine in 2018 and 2019 really didn't increase our overall expenditures that year, which is kind of interesting. What the expenditures have been kind of tied to in the past is our statewide use of calcium chloride. So that's the additive we use to speed melting, but it tends to be a lot more expensive than just typical road salt or brine. So you can kind of see the expenditures fluctuate with the calcium chloride. That is until this most recent winter season for which we have data. This was the first season during the pandemic. So from December 2020 to March 2021, really didn't have a whole lot comparatively applied to our roads, but the expenditures were through the roof. So this data was pulled from the New Jersey Department of Transportation's website. Kind of interesting, just a little piece of color here. They scrub their website every year of past data. They only include the last 2 years of data for how much they use and how much it costs. So I think they don't really want people to be able to kind of track these fluctuations over time. There's no explanation for why this price is so high, but you could make the argument that it's pandemic, supply chain, and labor shortages and all of that. So now that we kind of know how much road salt we're using, let's talk about the impact that it actually has on our environment. So first, there's 4 kind of different ways that we can measure the impact of road salt when we're looking at our surface waters, streams, lakes, ponds, rivers. We measure them in 4 major different ways. So salinity, chloride, conductivity, and total dissolved solids. Now I'm going to share some information in this table here. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I've included it for your reference if you'd like to look back on it. But generally, these are measured in different ways, but they're all kind of different ways to get at the same piece of information. How much dissolved stuff is in the water column? So salinity, that includes all of these dissolved salts, any of these charged ions together in the water. We would typically use that more for ocean water, for marine water, because freshwater, it's usually less than 0.5 parts per thousand. So that's kind of a very small amount compared to what would be in the ocean. Chloride, however, is probably more useful for us to use in freshwater systems. It is just one component of total salinity. And when you think back to the salts that we apply to the roads, sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, calcium chloride, they all have this chloride ion in common. So chloride is the measure that we use with the New Jersey Salt Watch program to really kind of dig into how road salt specifically is impacting freshwater. Conductivity and total dissolved solids are two other measures that are used. They are, perhaps Debbie will talk about this later, talking about kind of the integrated report and our regulatory use of this data, but there are water quality standards for total dissolved solids, so that that's a number that we can kind of use to compare throughout the state. We also have a water quality standard for chloride. So freshwater is we like to see that chloride value less than 100 milligrams per liter. But we do have a water quality standard in the state of New Jersey, and I think across most of the states where they have a water quality standard for chloride. It's at 230 milligrams per liter. So that's kind of the upper limit. Below 230, we're kind of, we're doing okay. Less than 100 is better, but less than 230 is okay. Once we get above 230, then that stream is considered impaired, and that kind of kicks it into that next level where we actually need to do something to fix that problem. So for all of these indicators, by the way, each one of these is typically higher in streams that are located in developed watersheds where we have more urbanization, more roads where we're applying road salt. That tends to lead to higher values in all of these categories. So just kind of speaking simply about the freshwater salinization, it can be lethal to the organisms that live in these freshwater systems. If you are adapted to a freshwater system, it's going to kind of wreak havoc on your cells if your environment around you suddenly becomes a lot saltier. So your cells, we kind of maintain this level of salinity inside of our cells. And so when the surrounding environment becomes more salty, then our cells kind of become desiccated. They release that water. They're trying to match the salinity of the external environment. Then it doesn't matter if this freshwater species is surrounded by water in this freshwater system, it's going to desiccate. And so you see in this really horrible picture to the right, this is a really great graphic example of what that can look like. So this photo, this was taken by the Muddy Branch Alliance in Gaithersburg, Maryland. This is just outside of Washington, D.C. And you can see we have an active fish kill going on. And I love this picture because they also include a picture of the chloride test strip right in the center here. So if you've participated in our Salt Watch program, this test strip will be familiar to you. For those of you who haven't, I'll explain this strip kind of in detail a little bit later. Basically what this strip is telling us is that the chloride concentration in this lake is off the charts. It goes above the calibrated range of values that this test strip is able to measure. Its upper limit is 650 milligrams per liter. Of course, that's well above our water quality standard of 230 milligrams per liter. So we have very, very salty conditions in this lake, and we can see the immediate consequences of that in this photo. Also, what can happen, we have fish kills, we have these organisms that can die off, and non-native species or invasive species can come in and kind of fill that niche space. So if they have a greater range of tolerance to different salinity levels, then they could thrive in this environment that's becoming saltier and saltier. So these native species are dying off, replaced with invasive species. There's also effects to organisms that may not kill them off entirely, but there are, physical responses, physiological responses of these organisms to their environment becoming saltier and saltier. This was a study done in 2017, looking specifically at rainbow trout. And they found that as the freshwater system became saltier, where these rainbow trout lived, their juveniles were decreasing in size. So as chloride levels increased, or as salinity increased, their size of their hatchlings was reduced by 30%. So just kind of an interesting response to this increase in salinity. May not kill them off, but they're definitely going to be impacted in some way. There was another study done in 2016 by some of the same folks that looked at wood frogs specifically. So wood frogs live next to a stream, that stream becomes saltier. What they found was that there was a change in the sex ratio of wood frogs born. And what that looked like was that more of the wood frogs were being born male rather than female. Interesting response there. Another study also done by some of these same folks in 2017, this one looked at Daphnia, which is a type of zooplankton. And this I thought was really, really interesting, because Daphnia, they have a kind of a short lifespan. We can find 5 to 10 generations over a period of 2.5 months. So, on our human time scale, we're able to really visibly see evolution happen in Daphnia. And what they found was that in an increasingly saline environment for Daphnia that live in freshwater, they were finding that the Daphnia were evolving over a period of 5 to 10 generations to be able to withstand greater salinity over that short period of time. Now, that kind of seems heartening, like, hey, these animals, they can adapt and we can change, and yeah, maybe everything's becoming salty, but maybe fish just become smaller and Daphnia just becomes saltier, and that's normal. But what these researchers then did with those adapted Daphnia, so after they had gone through this period of evolution, they took those Daphnia that were adapted to higher salinity, they put them in an environment with even higher salinity to see if that kind of evolution would continue, and they would continue to kind of become more tolerant to salinity. And that second batch, they all died off. So there is an upper limit to how much our freshwater species can really adapt and change over time, either behaviorally or physiologically, or through their life history strategies, to be able to withstand increasing salinity or chloride. There's also physical changes that an influx of salty water can make to lakes. So lakes, stratification is it's just kind of a normal thing that happens to lakes in New Jersey and, well, all over the planet. But salty water can kind of exacerbate the issue of stratification. So salt water, it's denser than fresh water. And so when salt water gets into a lake system, it's going to sink to the bottom of that lake. And it's going to kind of create this layer of fresh water on top that's lighter, salt water on the bottom that's denser. And so the bottom layer, there's not a whole lot of mixing happening. So we have a pretty strong layer there in that thermocline. We don't have a lot of mixing where the top is allowed to mix with the bottom. And so the bottom becomes very depleted of dissolved oxygen. It can be a totally anoxic environment, meaning there's no dissolved oxygen, or it could be hypoxic, meaning there's just very low levels of dissolved oxygen. But in either of those situations, under those conditions, what can happen is nutrients that are present in the sediments in the benthic substrate of that lake can start to leach out phosphorus into the water column from the sediment into the water itself. So we have low dissolved oxygen, increasing levels of phosphorus. So when the lakes do mix, like if they're even allowed to with that strong stratification, when they mix in the spring and the fall, what we can find is that phosphorus then feeds a huge amount of algal growth, of bacterial activity. And so it kind of leads us into this vicious cycle. So we have low dissolved oxygen leading to high phosphorus in the water column, leading to lots of metabolic activity, which then consumes dissolved oxygen, lowering dissolved oxygen. And this cycle just continues and continues. So I've included a picture here. This is a sign that the NJDEP will put up when we have harmful algal blooms. These are algal blooms that produce toxins. They can they're like neurotoxins. They can cause skin irritation. They can cause organ failure when they get to certain concentrations. But we are having an increase in algal blooms quite a bit over the past decade, maybe even 2 decades. We're seeing a lot more of these harmful algal blooms. And so the salinization of our freshwaters is really just going to exacerbate this existing problem. We can also see, just kind of widening our focus from the aquatic ecosystem, road salts will also have an impact on terrestrial plants as well. This photo I love. It's just such a perfect graphic example of salt being applied to that sidewalk over and over and over. We are trying to maintain human health and safety, sure, but you can see there is an immediate consequence then to the vegetation that surrounds this area that's being consistently salted. So the salt can kind of bind to nutrients, phosphate, to nitrate, which makes them unavailable for the plants to actually use to grow and thrive. The salt can physically harm those plants' leaves. This is what we're seeing here. And then over time, we can even see those plants just start to die off entirely. And same as what we saw in an aquatic ecosystem, where we see these native plants start to die off, we can see invasive plants then hop in, fill in that gap, and start to grow. So we can see kind of our ecosystems change entirely from this one factor. Of course, chloride and salinity in general can also impact our drinking water. So chloride can percolate through the soil and reach our groundwater, get into aquifers. It can also, if we have chloride dissolved in surface waters in a stream, the interaction between that surface water and the groundwater kind of changes depending on drought conditions. But if the surface water is feeding the groundwater, then anything that's dissolved in that surface water is going to leach into the groundwater as well. So about half of the population here in the United States use groundwater as their drinking water source, or well water. I'm not sure what the percent is here in New Jersey specifically, but I do know there's lots of areas of the state that are also using well water, so this will definitely impact them. And high levels of salt in our drinking water, they can just it can taste bad. It can just be like an aesthetic thing, but it can be more harmful to people who are ingesting that water unaware of the salt content. If you're on a low sodium diet, that can really add up, and that can become a serious health concern. For those people who are on public water systems, getting their water pumped from a surface water like the Delaware River or the Millstone River, that saltiness can impact your drinking water as well. So the more salinity, higher chloride levels, that increases the corrosivity of our water. So as it runs through pipes made of lead or copper, it's going to leach some of those metals into the drinking water itself. And that means that you've got water contaminated with lead or copper coming out of your tap. We saw a very visible example of this in Flint, Michigan, where they switched the drinking water source to a saltier water body. And they did not go through the extra step because it was more expensive. You can add orthophosphate to the drinking water that kind of creates like a crust on the inside of the pipe. so that the water itself doesn't interact directly with the metals on the inside of the pipe. But they didn't go through that step. Thus, their drinking water was highly contaminated with lead. We see that closer to home as well, Trenton, in Newark. So salty water, whether it's in surface water or in groundwater, is going to have an impact on our drinking water as well. That's the bad news. So let's talk about what we are doing to try to increase awareness of this and to start to combat this issue. The Isaac Walton League of America had an intern back in 2017. So their headquarters are in Gaithersburg, Maryland. That's right outside of DC. And there was an intern who walked outside on the road and saw a big pile of salt. And, the snow was done. No one came back to collect the salt. It was just kind of sitting there. And with every rainfall, just more of it was washing away. And so they went back inside and they're like, someone's got to do something about this. And being a national environmental organization with a strong monitoring program, they said, well, why don't we do something about this? So they created a program called Winter Salt Watch in 2017. And through this program, they connected with just regular people, community members locally and nationwide. They sent out these test kits with chloride test strips, created a place for that data to go, and started to learn more about chloride contamination all over the country. So in 2020, the New Jersey Watershed Watch Network took that program and adapted it for New Jersey. So our road salt impact study, our Salt Watch program, was taken from Isaac Walton Lake. The data that we collect, we kind of keep contained in our own system, but we then share it with the Isaac Walton League as well, so that they can have that full picture of what's going on throughout the country. So just before I go on, just a little bit about the New Jersey Watershed Watch Network, what that is. It's a program of the Watershed Institute. So that is the program that I run as the coordinator of the network. And it is funded by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So we've worked together to create the Watershed Watch Network. It's a service provider to monitoring organizations throughout the state. So we work with them to put together study designs, to help them write their QUAPs and get them approved, to communicate information from DEP to the volunteers in the field. We do trainings, we do field accreditations, macro ID testing, and the like. But one of our programs is the New Jersey Salt Watch program. So that's kind of how we have put this program together and got it out into the world. So just a little bit about the test, how it works. The first step for anyone who is interested in participating is heading to our website. That's at njwatershedwatch.org/roadsalt. And there's a little form there where you can put in your name, your address to receive the kit in the mail. And you let us know kind of how many streams you're monitoring and how many times you think you're going to be able to get to that stream before the end of March, April or so. So we recommend that if you participate, that you get out to that site at least 4 times over the course of the winter season, up to like 6 times. And so you kind of mix that up between periods that are dry, where there's kind of a baseline condition, it hasn't snowed, there's no salt applied to the roads, it hasn't rained. And we want people to also get out after a snowstorm, after salt's been applied, after there's been a rain event, so we can kind of see, the before and after of it all. The second step, once you have your test kits in hand, is you grab any container, rinse it, and fill it with a little bit of water from your stream or lake. So here, if you're close enough, you can just reach over and grab a sample of water. Maybe if you're a little bit, if it's harder to kind of lean down and get into your stream, you can attach a cup to the end of a broom handle. Or, if you really can't get into your stream, you could put a bucket on a rope. Any of these methods will work as long as you rinse your sampling container with that stream water before then filling it up to do the test. So the test itself is pretty simple. You just have a very kind of shallow bit of water in the bottom of your container, and you pop your test strip in. That strip is the water is going to rise through the strip. And I'm just going to play this video. This is from Isaac Walton Lake. You can see the water rising through the strip. When the top of the strip turns black, you know the test is complete. And at the bottom of the strip, we can see this white peak forming. So this is like kind of the titration happening within this strip. And it's the tip of that white peak that we're looking at to read our result. So we have a marking of 1 here, a 2 here. And these are basically 0.2 division. So it's like 1.2, 0.4, 0.6. We've landed on a 1.8 on this particular strip. So how do we read that? You compare the peak of your the white peak to this calibration table. So in the last example, we had a 1.8. We would just check this table. 1.8 means we have a final result of 49 milligrams per liter of chloride. So in this example on this sheet, this goes up to, let's say 4.2. Then this final result would be 175 milligrams per liter chloride. I want to just make a note here that our strips come with lot numbers. So they come in these bottles. You can see there's a lot number listed on the side of this bottle, lot A1351. And there is a specific calibration table associated with each of those lot numbers. So if you order a kit, you're going to receive a little baggie of these test strips and a copy of this calibration table. The calibration table sent to you is going to correspond with your strips only. So if you've got older copies of this little handout with older calibration tables, you want to toss those and only use the calibration table sent to you with your strips. The last step in this process, after you compare your result to your table, is you enter it to our online form. So you would just head to our website and click this button to submit your road salt data. It takes you to a simple form where you kind of drop a pin on a map to tell us exactly where you are in the world, in your stream, in your lake. Add some basic information about like the current weather conditions, of course, your name, your contact information, and your chloride result. And so what's great about this is you add this to the online map and it will immediately then show up in our web map that we share out with the public. So again, you can head to this website and this second tab here, view the data map, you can click on that to see our progress so far this season. So right now, if you click that, if you head to the website now, this will show the data collected for the 21 to 22 season. And when we start sending out the kits for this season, we'll update that for this year. So since December 2020, which is when we launched this program, we've had 162 individuals participate. They've been part of 36 different nonprofits, 8 schools, 15 environmental commissions or green teams at the municipal level. And all told, we've been able to collect 1,318 data points across the state. So this has been a very successful program. Again, thanks to you for participating. We have been able to really have a good look at chloride levels as they have changed over the past 2 seasons. And I am excited to see that number rise again this season and just continue this momentum. And because I listed them out before, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to acknowledge you. Thanks to those organizations listed here for participating. Really, we could not do it without you. All right, so here's a look at the data map. This is from the first season, specifically January and February, data points collected in January, February 2021. And we can see, so, you know, red means bad. Red dots are those impaired sites that have more than 230 milligrams per liter chloride. That exceeds our New Jersey water quality state standard. And we can see that they're kind of concentrated in our more urban sections where we have a little bit more development, a little bit here in Trenton, a little bit here in like Rahway into Piscataway, up here at Lake Apatcong. And also here in the eastern part of Monmouth County, these data points were collected by Clean Ocean Action. I want to make a point here that you may be thinking, hey, that's the ocean. Of course it's going to be salty. Yes, the ocean is salty. But for our study, we are specifically looking at freshwater systems. So it has to be freshwater to kind of qualify for this study. All of these data points were collected in freshwater specifically. It just so happens that this is also a very urban area. So we see that reflected in our chloride values as well. So looking 1 year ahead, these are the results in January to February of 2022, earlier this year. And we see kind of the same pattern present itself. We've had some of the geographic gaps filled in a little bit. So we still see over here in Monmouth County, we have a lot of those impairments happening. Still even more so in Trenton, in Rahway, Piscataway. We have more data points now in the Camden area, which is uncovering more impairments along the Cooper River. And this stretch, this line here, this is the Musconetcong River. So the Musconetcong Watershed Association made a huge push in this last season to really formalize their own chloride monitoring program as part of our statewide program. And they empowered their own volunteers to get out. And so we have a lot of data along the Musconetcong River up to Lake Apatcong here as well. And so you kind of see these dark green points. These are the areas with lower chloride levels below 100 milligrams per liter. They're kind of sporadically placed, but they tend to occur in areas that are less developed, where we just have less roads and fewer people. Now, if you're like, hey, zoom in on this map, I want to look at my local area. Don't worry, you can head to this website and the map is live there and you can zoom in and it's interactive and you can look at the actual values near you. So looking at this all told, I don't know if this is blocking up here. But anyway, so yeah, these are all of the measurements that we've collected since the beginning of our program in December 2020, our 1,300 or so data points. All told, about a half of those data points are below 100 milligrams per liter. That's in our bright green zone where things are looking good. About a quarter of our total results across the whole study are in this kind of yellow range. It's not exceeding the water quality standard, but it could be approaching that. And then all told, 18% of all of our samples across the state did exceed that water quality standard of 230 milligrams per liter. So here's a distribution of those measurements, how many measurements were kind of at each of these levels. So chloride is here along the x-axis, and the y-axis is just like how is the histogram. So how many measurements were in each of these categories. So you'll kind of see that it was skewed a little bit to the lower range, which is good. We had more of those results, as we saw in the last graph. About 54% of our samples were below 100 milligrams per liter here, which is this line here. So you may be wondering what's happening with this bar down at the bottom and what's happening all the way at the top. So our test strips have a minimum detection limit of 29, and that's where this bar stops here. So this is the lowest that the strips can reliably measure, but some of the measurements that our volunteers are getting back are below that calibrated level. So we have that calibration table. It starts at like 1.2 or 1.6. It kind of varies depending on the lot of strips. But some of those results, in fact, a lot of these results are below that level. So that is this big line here. These are the results that are below that method detection limit. And just for display purposes, for statistical analysis purposes, we've marked these as a 15 milligrams per liter. It's unlikely that they are all 15 milligrams per liter. They are somewhere below 29 and above 0, but it's really difficult for us to tell with this method. So that's why they're kind of all clumped there. Now, at the other end of this spectrum, this bar, this represents our maximum detection limit. That's 650 milligrams per liter. So any of the results that came back above the level of our calibration range of the test strip, they could be at a minimum 650. They could go up to, I don't know, 1 million. You know, it's really anything above 650. But beyond that point, we can't really tell with this method, with the test strips that we're using. So that's why these are all clumped there. Now, looking at the results over the past 2 years, I've grouped them into months. So we can look at kind of what's happening month by month. So first, in December, we're finding that a little over 70% of all of our measurements are less than 100 milligrams per liter. It's a little bit lower when we get into January. In January, it's more likely that we've had some snow, we've had some salt applied to the roads. And so we're seeing that reflected in this distribution of different condition categories, these concentration categories of chloride. In February, we see even more of those impairments happening, less of those really great measurements below 100 milligrams per liter. And then in March, we kind of come back up. In April, come back even further. And then in May and June, I know this is a big caveat, there's only 3 measurements collected in May and June, but all of those did kind of meet our internal standard of a healthy system, which is 100 milligrams per liter. So another way to look at that is just in specifically impairments. So we have seen most of our impairments happen in the month of February. So really nothing in December, nothing in May, June, but we're seeing that distribution kind of increase to February and then start to decrease. So all of our exceedances for the winter salt watch program happened between January 3rd and April 5th. Now here we're looking at this data in a slightly different way. So I've categorized each measurement according to the weather condition during which they were observed. So we have green, this green box plot indicates those measurements that were collected during dry conditions. This means there was no snow, there was no snow melt, there was no rain within the past 72 hours. The yellow bar, this is snow melt. So snow has happened, salt has been applied to the roads, and the snow is actively melting into the stream. So this is this yellow bar. The red bar is when it has snowed in the past 72 hours. So salt has been applied in the last 72 hours as well. And blue, these are our wet measurements, meaning if there's been rain combined with snow melt, kind of typically a combination of those things in the winter months. And of course, gray is our NA. Because this data is crowdsourced, it's a little difficult to kind of mandate that the exact same information is collected every time. So we do have some measurements where we're not really sure what the weather condition was when it was collected, but I've included those here. So we can see that the range of measurements that were collected during a snow melt event and during a rain event, during a wet event, are a little bit wider and skew a little bit further north into those higher chloride ranges. And this black bar in the center, or not in the center, in the middle of this black box plot, this indicates the median. So below this level, 50% of those measurements occurred below that black bar, and 50% of the measurements occurred above that black bar. So we can see that a lot of our measurements were a little bit higher under a wet condition in January. Now in February, we see that we have a lot of that variability happening under snow conditions. So after the snow has been applied, after the salt has been applied and snow has fallen, we see some of that immediate melt that happens. And so under these snowy conditions, we have a lot of these results that kind of skew upwards into those higher values. In March, we're seeing less of that variability. What's interesting here is that our median for the NA values is higher than everything else. So, it would be really great to know what's actually happening when the weather condition wasn't specified. But, we have what we have. But the second highest median occurs under these snow conditions. Then when we look at April and then December, which is the 2 other months that we're collecting data for this particular program, it's kind of all over the place, but we find that in December, our dry weather chloride is higher than our wet weather. And so keep that in mind as we look at, we'll look at the next slide and that will make a little bit more sense. But here is looking at our winter salt watch results, all grouped together regardless of month, just looking at the weather conditions. So this blue mark, this is our 100 milligram per liter ideal level. And so if it falls below this blue mark, it's looking really good. Then this red line, this is our water quality standard, 230 milligrams per liter. Results that fall above that are going to be in the danger zone. So we're finding that under the wet conditions, this is the only median that falls above the 100 milligram per liter standard. But when you look at the arithmetic mean, you can see that the highest values occur under snow and snow melt conditions. So what's happening here? The median is lower, but the mean is higher. That means that we have a lot more of these outliers up in the 650 milligram per liter range that are pulling those means upward. So while most of the results are happening below 100 milligrams per liter, we do have quite a few of these outliers up in the very high range as well. Okay, we're switching gears just a little bit to look at the data we collected in the summer months. So this is not the New Jersey Salt Watch program. This is the Watershed Institute's Stream Watch volunteer water quality monitoring program. I decided to incorporate chloride into our summer bacterial action team this past summer to just kind of see, hey, what's happening in the summer compared to the winter. Boy, am I glad I did. So I've included this red line. This is the 230 milligram per liter state standard again. And you can see that in the summer months, all of these conditions are well above this standard. So even though the salt is actively being applied in the winter months, we are going to see very, very high results in the summertime. And that is because we had a very droughty summer. And so we saw that when there's less water, the concentration of chloride in the water is going to increase. So we measure chloride again by milligrams per liter. When the milligrams of chloride stays the same, but the quantity of water lowers, our concentration is going to go up. And we definitely saw that this past summer. Very, very high results. So here's just a look at the distribution of those results across the x-axis. This is the concentration of chloride, and this red mark shows the upper boundary of our test strips. With this method, we're able to measure into those higher values, and we definitely saw those higher values represented up to 1,849 milligrams per liter. And just looking at both of these monitoring programs together, New Jersey Salt Watch, which is December to April, and our Stream Watch program, which went from May to August, boy, do we see lots of impairments happening in the summer months. It approaches 100% of our sites. We were monitoring 55 sites. Almost 100% of them were impaired this summer. So this is very closely connected to levels of development in our watershed. You could look at this by looking at the Stony Brook watershed on the left or the Assunpink Creek watershed on the right. In both cases, what we would call the lower watershed, which is like the further downstream sections, they're more highly developed, and that's indicated by the red on this graph. So in the Stony Brook, the lower watershed has 9% impervious surfaces compared to 3% in the upper. And Assunpink Creek has 28% impervious surface in the lower, 18% in the upper. So is that going to be reflected in our chloride values? Indeed, it will be. So the measurements collected in the lower sections of these subwatersheds, you can see they're indicated by the kind of like salmon colored dots on this graph. The measurements in the upper subwatersheds are blue, and we definitely see that the values the measurements taken in our lower, more developed areas do skew higher. We have higher chloride in those watersheds or in those streams than we do in the upper sections of the. And we can also see that, you know, the continuous monitoring is a really great way for us to track the data as it progresses during the storm. So with a test strip, we're just coming in, popping the test strip in. We're not going to, you know, sit next to the stream for hours on end to continue to collect those measurements. I wouldn't advise that. But you can see continuous measurements allow us to just track this as the storm happens. So we can see over a period of 3 months, we have snow events, we have rain events happening. This red line shows conductivity, and our conductivity levels remain relatively flat. Not a lot of change in this pristine, undeveloped watershed. Here's this graph normalized for the graph that I'm about to show you. So this is the same graph that I just showed you. Conductivity levels are very, very low compared to the fluctuations we see in conductivity in an urbanized watershed. So we see an immediate response to snow events, to road salt events in our conductivity, as opposed to an area where there's not a lot of roads. So it, you know, it doesn't take a huge intellectual leap to find that more roads equal more salt in our streams. And the percentages that we saw here in New Jersey are similar across the whole state. How did we fit into the national picture? Pretty well. Overall, 18% of the samples we've collected with New Jersey Salt Watch exceeded the 230 milligram per liter standard. Same for the entire country as a whole. A lot of that happened in Wisconsin and Chicago, but overall, about 20% of our samples are toxic. So just a final plug before I hand it off to Debbie. You can get involved too this season to help us collect data. Head to that website, njwatershedwatch.org/road salt, and fill out that form, and you can help contribute to this study. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass it off now to Debbie Kratzer from DEP.
Okay, you can go to the next slide. So this is just an outline of what I'm going to go over. And so as Erin Wasaying, when we put down salt, I used to think, and I think a lot of people think, that since salt can dissolve in water, that it's just going to wash away with precipitation. But unfortunately, it doesn't. And even as early as the 1970s, scientists were realizing that there were impacts to roadside vegetation, well water, streams, and ponds from the road salt, and they were showing that in the studies that they were doing. And we've also seen that up to 77% of salt that has been applied to roads ends up being retained in the surface water, groundwater, and soils. So that means that salt levels are often not even returning to background levels before the next season, the next winter of salting begins. Next. So Erin touched on the standards, so how much salt is too much. And when we're talking about road salt impacts, we're looking at chloride, total dissolved solids, and specific conductants, as Erin reviewed. And one thing that she didn't cover is that there's also a standard for acute toxicity of chloride, which is a the level of 860 milligrams per liter. And the way we measure that is if the level is like one sample or 1 hour above that level is acutely toxic for aquatic life. And then the number that she mentioned in her presentation, the 230 milligrams per liter, when we are assessing for the integrated report, that has to be, that's based on a 4-day average, because chronic is, showing that is staying at that level for a longer amount of time. And also, road salt isn't the only source of chloride. There's also water softeners, fertilizers, manure, industrial discharges, and dust suppression on dirt and gravel roads. I don't know how common that is in New Jersey, but that can be another source as well. Next. So the GIF that's going shows the change in how many of our sub-watersheds are being impaired for chloride and total dissolved solids over the years. So New Jersey DEP is required by the Federal Clean Water Act to conduct a biennial assessment of the overall health of New Jersey's water resources. And then we need to take appropriate steps to restore and maintain and protect our water resources and the designated uses. So these TDS and chloride are becoming more of a problem over the years. And at first I think it was thought that, these are just transitory exceedances of these standards and, not to worry about it too much. But as it's increasing, we see the toxicity and it becoming a bigger and bigger problem. So in the 2020 report, the most recent one, there were 39 sub-watersheds that exceeded the total dissolved solids standards for aquatic life and 8 assessment units that exceeded the chronic chloride standard for aquatic life. And it should be noted that these sub-watersheds are within or partially within 128 municipalities of the state. So that's almost a quarter of the state's municipalities are seeing these impacts. Okay, next. So in this graph, we downloaded like 100,000 data points from the water quality portal, and that had been collected between 1997 and 2018 from freshwater. And we see even like on a statewide median, chloride is increasing, and it has tripled since 1997. Next. And using that same data set as the previous slide, we see that the percent of samples that exceeded the standard has increased each year. So we went from 1997 and 1998, where there were no exceedances in the data, and to more frequent exceedances over the years. The next graph. And looking at the same data set in another way, we divided up the data by month. And as Erin's graphs also showed this, we're seeing that the exceedances most commonly occur in the winter months, and especially January, February, and March. Next. So specific conductance is a measure of the electrical conductance of water, and it is influenced by a number of different constituents in the water. So there's no standard for it because it can be made up of many different things. Chloride tends to be a large portion of it, but we don't have a standard for specific conductance because we don't know for sure which ion or is causing the high levels, but it is closely related. It's a good way to measure whether the stream is being impacted. It is much easier measurement and less expensive measurement, and also because you can have continuous data loggers, so you can see those peaks that are happening when you're not necessarily out there collecting data all the time. So the Bureau of Freshwater and Biological Monitoring at DEP has been deploying specific connectivity meters at various locations throughout the state. And it's useful to identify which water bodies may be impacted and where additional monitoring is needed, such as taking grab samples for chloride and total dissolved solids concentrations. Next. So we can skip this one. Erin went over this one and the next one. So to summarize our water quality data analysis, we've identified increasing trends and impairments in TDS and chloride in our surface waters. And we've identified that the highest values and exceedances are occurring in the winter following the application of road salt for de-icing. Next. So what are we doing about it? At first, it seems like maybe this is too big of a problem to address, but I don't think that's the case. New Jersey has stormwater regulations concerning road salts, and I'm going to review those here. First of all, municipalities have to have a permanent structure for the storage of de-icers, so that precipitation doesn't just wash that salt off into our streams and into the environment. They require the pollution prevention and good housekeeping, so it's not spilled, so spills are cleaned up and they don't go out into the environment. Equipment needs to be cleaned off rather than just hosed off, like you get any dry salt first before washing equipment. Street sweeping, and a new one for the new permit in 2023 is removing excess piles of salt and de-icing materials that have been left on the roads, and that was added for highway agencies in 2020, but now it will also be added for municipal permits. Another new requirement will be that private salt storage, the municipalities will have to adopt an ordinance that requires private companies that have salt storage, that they have to be covered as well. Like municipalities have to have their salt stored. So the picture on the right shows like a pile of salt with just a tarp over it, and you can, the caption says that the picture was taken in August. So obviously the salt was not being used, but it was just out in the weather, and that salt was just a constant source flowing down to the bottom corner of the photo is a storm drain. So so this is a new requirement to prevent that from happening. And then the final thing is that employees have to be trained, and there are reporting requirements. Next. New Jersey DEP also has a snow removal and disposal policy, so that like snow with de-icers mixed in with it are not just dumped into water bodies or wetlands. And so that's what this requirement is about. So next. And then the highway agency guidance document for stormwater permitting does have additional measures that are optional in Chapter 11 of that report. Next. So what can we do? We can educate ourselves and those around us on how to use less salt. We want to maintain safety, but it's important to remember that more salt is not better. More salt doesn't make things safer. the goal is to maintain safety, but at the same time, reducing salt use and using the right amount. So this, for example, only a teaspoon of salt is enough to permanently pollute 5 gallons of water, up to that level of 230 milligrams per liter. So we want to use as little salt as possible, because everything we do is impacting the water. The easiest thing to do is to shovel as much as possible and to use as little salt as possible. And the right amount of salt is to scatter it around so that there's space between the granules of salt, and not like what we often see, like a solid covering of salt. That's way too much. And the the final one on this slide is switching. If the temperature is below 15 degrees, the salt isn't going to work. So if it's still icy, you can switch to something that will just increase the traction, like sand. It doesn't melt the snow or ice at all, but it will make conditions a little safer. Okay, next. So here's another way of looking at this. Is just another resource that kind of says the same thing that I just said on the previous slide, just shows it in a different way, and illustrating that these little 12-ounce cups are not buckets. So a 12-ounce cup is the right amount of salt for about 20 feet of driveway or 12 sidewalk squares, not a bucket full. Okay, next. And this is just another educational resource that shows the same information in another way. So next. And another thing we can do is to use snow tires, maintain our cars, drive slower, drive less if it's an option, and also have reasonable expectations regarding the road conditions in winter weather. Next. But what are some big things we can do? Well, we can go to the next slide. So best management practices can be grouped into 5 categories. And these include materials, sustainability and the environment, weather and information, equipment, operations and tactics, and strategies, public relations and training. So I'll go through an example of each of these. So the next slide is under that first category. So basically, a lot of other states and some trade organizations like the Snow and Ice Management Association have been developing and testing best management practices that municipalities in New Jersey could also implement for their winter road maintenance, and it would help them maintain safety but also reduce their salt use by a lot. So an example under the materials sustainability environment is matching the type of de-icing material to the local weather conditions. So avoiding using sand except in cold ice storms, like I mentioned before. Even low impact development policies. There's some really innovative ideas about like making sure that your entryway of your, say, store or building is faced to the south so that the ice won't form because the sun will help melt the snow. Next. Under weather and information, these are some really great ways to reduce salt use. There's a system called Road Weather Information Systems, and it gives real-time weather sensor information to those people out there applying the salt so that they know when salt is needed and what's the frequency, and then also when it's not. If it's going to get warm, for example, then they don't need to be applying some salt. Other ways of using information to improve practices is to keep track of materials use and staff time. I really, we really lack this information. So if you change your practices, we don't even know if you're using more or less salt, because we're not keeping good track of it. And other different kinds of performance measurements about keeping track of safety, whether customer satisfaction. I know that has to be a priority for municipalities and road maintenance agencies. And another tool they can use is automated vehicle location, which is a fancy way of saying that they use GPS, and then they can analyze that information to optimize their applications. Next. The third category is equipment. So they could obtain automated spreader controls that are programmed to adjust for the speed and location of the vehicle. The route tracking, like I already mentioned, brine mixing. So a lot of, Erin was talking about brine a lot. So brine uses a lot less salt than using just directly the salt, because it's dissolved in the salt, in the water, and so less can be used, and it's also more effective. But it takes a little bit of an investment into the new equipment that's needed. Okay, next. So operations and tactics, just implementing the anti-icing with brine is one of them. Calibrating your salt flow output has been shown to be one of the most effective, and also not really that hard to do. It's just a new practice to do, to make sure that the right amount of salt is coming out, not too much or too little. Improved communication between the operators, operation controllers, and the snowplow drivers. Pre-wetting the salt. It's a way of adding some moisture to the salt before it's applied, and it helps it not bounce off the road. If it's off the road, it's not going to be doing the job that we need it to do. And also keeping the trucks at a lower speed. So that also keeps the salt on the roads. Next. So the last category of best management practices is just having more training for Department of Public Works or other snow professionals, or road people who treat parking lots and everywhere, so that they can know that there's a reason why they should use the right amount, not too much, of salt and other de-icers. And another way is to develop a snow plan. So if the temperature is this and the forecast is this, then what should you be doing? So when it's all laid out, then everyone knows what is the expectation. And of course, we always need adequate funding when we want to improve the way we do things. The great thing about the best management practices for reducing road salt is that many of the practices actually save money. And then that savings could go to fund maybe the next best management practice to improve practices even more. Okay, next. So this is just, as I was just saying, there's success stories where these best management practices have resulted in cost savings of 30 to 50%. For example, in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, they just trained their staff better. They didn't even really need to invest in like the whole list of best management practices, but just being able to have their staff be more aware of the right way of doing things. They were able to save $40,000. Similarly, in Twin Cities, Minnesota, they replaced some equipment and saved over $50,000. In Richfield, Minnesota, they got some new equipment and had alternate de-icers being used, and they saved $70,000. Next. So actually, I was going to take this slide out, but anyway, separate from my job at DEP, I'm working on doing a sustainable Jersey action for road salt, and so that's in the works. Next. So at DEP, we have a restoration grant that was awarded to Brick Township Municipal Utilities Authority, and they're working on doing a workshop for DPWs to learn about some of these BMPs, and then to implement some to show that that these BMPs are applicable to New Jersey, and that they're doable, and they will improve practices, and we'll be able to reduce some road salt. At DEP, we're also working on a white paper about some of our road salt data, and also a total maximum daily load to address those impairments that I mentioned previously. And the TMDL will involve stakeholdering and implementation, and of course always additional data collection. And that is my last slide.
Great, thank you, Debbie. We have a few questions, so I'm gonna run through them quick. Does brine affect water bodies more or less as opposed to non-dissolved road salts? Does the dilution into a brine help at all? And Erin, I think you wanted to answer this one, or?
Oh, no, I think I clicked answer live because Debbie had referenced it in her presentation.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Does street sweeping help, or is it just pushing the salt around? I've never seen anyone officially collecting road salt, and shouldn't there be some requirement on distribution equipment to function correctly? So I think, Debbie, you talked a little bit about this.
Yeah, so that's going to be, so you probably haven't seen it be done because it's going to be a new requirement. The street sweepers are, those ones, they kind of, they sweep those trucks sweep the materials up into like a collection. So yeah, it should help.
Yeah, and so hopefully that is going to be in the 2023 MS4 permit, which
right.
Go into effect, assuming it comes out on January 1st. All right. Surfaces for which we have more options for materials to use. Are there options that are easier to maintain a safe level of clearance with less salt? So are there better surfaces for roads than what we're using?
That's a matter of additional research, but some research has shown that like pervious paving requires less salt because the water drains away from it.
All right. What sort of standards do private snow removal and management companies that service residential developments and commercial properties have to adhere to?
Currently there aren't any, but that the new MS4 permit that will come out next year, or hopefully at the beginning of next year, they'll have to at least store their salt in covered, some sort of a covered structure.
And just to clarify, so the requirement to go back after a storm and pick up the excess salt deposits, that is a responsibility of the municipality, wouldn't necessarily be the responsibility of like homeowners associations or other private owners of roads. Right.
It wouldn't be required, but certainly, if you're hiring someone, you can put requirements on them because if you're paying them.
Yep. So if you're a homeowners association, your board could ask for those additional requirements in your annual contract. talking about these sustainable Jersey guidelines. Are they ready, or when will they be ready?
So I've worked on a draft for them, but it wasn't like quite to their satisfaction in how it would be implemented. So it's not quite ready yet.
All right. And then are there any grants for training and implementation of best practices for public works departments?
Not currently.
All right. And there are a lot of places that do provide training and best practices. So there are some stuff there. All right. And with that, I think we are actually, nope. Are these best practices implemented in state roads? Yep. So NJDOT, the county DOTs, the municipal public works all have to comply with the same standards. Yeah. So, all right. With that, again, I greatly appreciate everyone's participation. Debbie and Erin, thank you very much for providing your expertise and knowledge. I got to learn a lot. And so with that, just remember, we are not going to have a technical Friday on in December, but we will have one in January. We have a panel of attorneys, so exciting, talking about representing objectors in land use boards. What are the rules? What are the practices? How to best represent your clients at land use boards. So again, thank you very much. A recording of this presentation will be going out in a week or so. And everyone have a very good day. Thank you very much.